Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Share Screen Africa presentation, which forms part of the Beyond the Surface series. I welcome everybody, but especially the TUT students who are our primary audience today. So I'm going to go back to the year 1284. It was the coastal town of Haarlem in Germany that was infested with rats. These were brought in by passing ships. The place was so infested with them that there wasn't a barn or a corn, a storeroom or a cupboard that they didn't eat their way into. Now they used cats and they used poison to try to mitigate the problem before employing a Pied Piper with a magical flute who eventually led the rats away. Now we fast forward to the year 2023 and we no longer need colorfully dressed musicians. We now have the magic of science. At the forefront, dealing with invasive species, we have Professor Julie Coetzee. Now, Prof. Coetzee works with the Center of Biological Control, the CBC, and Rhodes University, where she serves as its Aquatic Weeds Program Manager and Deputy Director. She completed a PhD at the University of Witwatersrand in 2003. Her research biological control system started in 2005, when she and others conducted research that showed that in all the water bodies where they had observed the water hyacinth growing. Through the efforts of the CBC's Seizoenke program, various schools and community groups in the area surrounding Hartbeespoort Dam, she and her team reduced the water hyacinth coverage on the dam from 42% to under 2%. The results of this augmented biological control program have already far exceeded her expectations and have garnered a great deal of local and international attention. Now, Professor Coetzee and her team are currently working on finding biological control program for the invasive Salvinia weed on the dam. And with that, I hand over to you, Professor Julie Coetzee.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and welcome all the students, or should I say thank you for welcoming me and thank you for having me to share some of the research that I do and to give you a little bit of background on invasive species. And hopefully next time you're driving through the Sabi region, that should be a grassland, and you all think, what a beautiful forest, suddenly you think, oh my goodness, look at all those invasive species. It's just something we need to be aware of. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So yes, as Aisha said, I work for the Center for Biological Control at Rhodes University, and I've been working on what we call the world's worst aquatic weed, otherwise known as water hyacinth, since I was in honors, which was a very long time ago. So you guys are in second year right now. You've got third year and then your fourth year. So my fourth year, I started to work on water hyacinth. That was in 1998. It's now 2023, and I'm still working on this plant. But I've learned a lot. I still have a lot more to learn, and I'm hoping I'll just share with you a little bit this morning on why I do what I do, and hopefully spark some interest to you all as well. So we're going to talk about what drives and also limits aquatic weed invasions. And I just want to remove that thing. I just want to start this with a quote from 1987, which probably seems like a very long time ago to a lot of you, but to me it was when I was a child. And it says, if we are to deal with nature as it is, as opposed to some idealized view of pristine nature, we'd better strive to understand the ecology of invading organisms. So this was about, what, 30 years ago that people really started noticing the impacts that invasive species were having on our ecosystems, on agriculture, and also on our own livelihoods. But invasion biology as a science started in about 1958 when a really famous ecologist, Charles Elton, published a book called The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. And this book is still referred to very much today. So it set the scene for invasion biology as a science. And what Charles Elton said back in 1958 is they, or biological invasions, are really happening more commonly. Indeed, they are so frequent nowadays in every continent and island, and even in the oceans, that we need to understand what is causing them and try to arrive at some general viewpoint about the whole business. So ecologists in the 1930s really got to understand how ecosystems work, how predator-prey models worked, and so forth. And then they suddenly started realizing how invasive species might be changing all this. And that's where we end up today. So in 1982, SCOPE, which is the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment, said there are 3 questions we need to answer in order to understand invasive species. Why are some species invaders and others not? What makes a rose a beautiful ornament, an ornamental garden flower, but what makes something like pom-pom weed, which I'm sure you guys at TUT have seen, it's that pink plant that invades the grasslands, becomes invasive? Why are some ecosystems prone to invasion and others aren't? And how should management of ecosystems be developed in light of the answers to the above? So why do we want to manage these species? Largely because of the impact that they have. And the impacts are what we need to mitigate. And that's impacts on our ecosystems, on our biodiversity, impact on our livelihoods, impact on our economy. And in 1998, which wasn't that long ago, but probably still quite a long time for a lot of you guys, JISP, the Global Invasive Species Program, was launched. And this is where we get the statement, invasive species are now recognized as one of the leading global threats to native biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So they were always second to habitat destruction up until about 1998. And now tied in with global change, with elevated CO2, we can't disentangle any of these effects, and we have to look at all of these in order to try and preserve our biodiversity. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about water hyacinth, which is the world's worst invasive aquatic weed. It's a floating plant. And just from the picture, which is taken from Lake Victoria in Kenya not too long ago, you see people trying to row across what should be an open body of water. And in fact, instead, they're stuck. They're completely closed in by this plant. So the impact on their livelihoods, because they rely on this water body for transport, for food, for communication, this plant has impacted every aspect of their livelihoods. Similarly, Lake Tana in Ethiopia, the Buriganga River in Bangladesh. And just take a second to have a look at that. That is a whole series of boats being put across a river so that people can actually make use of the system. And how did water hyacinth get to be as invasive as it is? And I don't know if any of you know this, but water hyacinth originated from the Amazon. So in South America, in the watersheds of the Amazon River, water hyacinth, that's where it evolved. And in that natural system, it's just part of the ecosystem. So then how did it become this plant that completely covers aquatic water bodies? In 1884, there was a cotton, that was an exposition. It was called the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition, or the World's Fair. And this opened in New Orleans in Louisiana, which is in the southern USA. And it was a time where the cotton industry was at its maximum, probably not a very, quite an infamous industry in terms of what it did to people's rights. But at this point, one of the people who came to the exposition was a Japanese person. And as a sort of going away present, you know, when you go to parties these days, you get a gift box or what do kids call a party pack. He pretty much gave anyone who wanted it one of these water hyacinth plants to take back with them to wherever they came from. So people had come from all over the world to this World's Fair and left with a water hyacinth plant. And obviously some of them would have put it in their ponds, some of them would have put it in a river. And as the plant started to grow and take over, they would have emptied out their pond, their little fish tank, and thrown it into a dam or a lake. And so water hyacinths spread around the world and became particularly problematic. This is a picture from 1898 from the Harper's Weekly, which was an important newspaper in the US. And this is from Florida, which is not too far from Louisiana. And here you can see one of those typical Mississippi, or I guess, yeah, a Florida steamboat, completely blocked in by water hyacinths. So if we go back, 1884 was the World's Fair. 1898, this river was completely taken over by water hyacinths. So very quickly, water hyacinths became a huge problem. And yes, the plant got to South Africa, and our first record of it was on the Vaal River. And I'm sure you all know the Vaal River is one of our most important rivers. It's the second longest until it joins the Orange River, where it then becomes the biggest system. And this system has been plagued with water hyacinths. This is a picture that I took in about 2008 or 9. And this was about a 10-kilometer stretch of water hyacinth on the Vaal River. In South Africa, water hyacinth is distributed in every single province. KZN is particularly bad. In Mpumalanga, you can see here along the Crocodile River, Gauteng, Northwest, this is the Vaal River, and of course the Western Cape and some systems in the Eastern Cape. So it's widely spread around South Africa, causing all kinds of impacts. So why do we get rivers outside of the native range that support populations of this plant, when in the natural range, this is what the plant looks like? So this is the Pantanal in Brazil. You can see water hyacinth, little patches of it occurring quite happily with these giant water lilies. Why do we go from this type of scenario when in the indigenous range, this is what it looks like? And it's all about top-down versus bottom-up drivers. And I'm not sure how much you've done of this in ecology or in high school, but we look at things like food pyramids, where we have bottom-up drivers, which are driven by the amount of resources. And in this case, here, the resources could be nutrients in the sediment, perhaps nutrients in the water, as well as things like light. So these bottom-up drivers govern how much green stuff there is, how many plants are in the system, and what the productivity of those plants is. And that then governs the amount of herbivores. And in this case, we've got little macroinvertebrates, which would feed on the plants. Those herbivores, the number of herbivores obviously then drive the number of carnivores. And in this case, it's carnivorous fish. And then we get the top predators, which are limited by how many fish or the food availability below them. So that's bottom up. Then we get top down. And in this case, the ecosystem is governed by the pressure from the top predators. So how many predators in the system would govern how many, I guess, second or food, prey availability, sorry, that skipped my mind, that word, prey, how much prey there is, and that the prey of the top predators then will eat these macroinvertebrates, which then will have a top-down effect on the amount of plants in the ecosystem. And in most ecosystems, it's a combination of top-down and bottom-up processes. And this is something that I've over time have realized we have to understand in order to be able to control particularly aquatic invasive plants. So just to put this into more of a stylized diagram, we've got limiting resources at the bottom. And these are things that limit net primary productivity, or NPP. They determine energy flow, and we've got water, nutrients, light, etc. And as I said, primary producers determine how many herbivores, which determine how many primary carnivores, determine secondary. And if we go in the opposite direction, top down, energy flow is governed by these top predators, which influence the levels below. Now, unfortunately, invasive species become invasive a lot of the time because limiting resources suddenly become abundant. And so when you've got abundant resources, and in this case, it's mostly nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus, we get a huge pool of primary producers. And in South Africa, the reason why we have such a huge pool of primary producers is because of our polluted water. And now more than ever, we're all aware of how bad our water quality is. Hammanskraal at the moment is dealing with cholera outbreaks and death from cholera, and this is largely due to untreated sewage. The OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, said that there should not be more than 0.1 milligrams per liter of phosphorus in water bodies. And that is the absolute most, and we call that hypertrophic. Oligotrophic, oligo meaning a little, trophic meaning the nutrient level is what we would strive for, and hypertrophic is the absolute worst. In South Africa, our water quality guidelines are a little different. And if you have a look here, OECD says hypertrophic is 0.1. What do we say in South Africa? 0.25. That is more than double the standard that the rest of the world is set to. And as a result, we've got very poor water. And this is largely due to inadequate treatment of sewage. We know all about our failing sewage works, lack of waterborne sewage in informal settlements, so sewage just going straight into water bodies, non-point inflow from agricultural runoff. And to fix this water-related infrastructure in 2016, the estimate was at least 570 billion rand over the next decade. And I think it's probably a lot more now. And this is very highlighted. Anthony Cherson is quite a water activist. And this is just a picture showing exactly what a lot of the issues are. And as a result, we have got dirty water. Hartbeespoort Dam looking like pea soup, Crocodile River West looking like pea soup, Rhodopla Dam looking like pea soup, and oh look, it's also got water hyacinth on it. Umbazambo Swamp in KZN, covered in water hyacinth. In the background is a paper mill, and this paper mill just pours out all of its byproduct of producing paper into the swamp, and it's largely nitrates and phosphates. So water hyacinth just explodes. And this is just a picture of some of my colleagues showing you how huge these water hyacinth plants can get. This is Grant. He's a very, very tall guy, and that is a very big water hyacinth plant. So if we have these dirty systems, what is happening to the biodiversity in these systems? And we know that water hyacinth reduces macroinvertebrate diversity. So the macroinvertebrates are these little guys in this level, and they're the thingies that are eating plankton, eating plants, and provide a lot of food for other systems. So if you're disturbing one level of this food pyramid, you're going to be having knock-on effects all the way through. And that's just a picture of these guys. And that's one of the reasons why we need to control these plants, because of the impact that they have on biodiversity. This is a picture I took in Kruger National Park on the Makatsi Spruit, which is up near Letaba. I showed you little chochos over here, and imagine what's happening to these big chochos who also rely on these systems. So what do? We've got abundant resources. We've got a huge amount of primary producers. What do we need to do? Increase the top-down pressure. So we've got huge bottom-up resources. Let's increase the top-down pressure, and maybe then we can reduce the amount of primary production. And that's where biological control comes in. So I mentioned that water hyacinth is from the Amazon, was introduced in here to South Africa, and it arrives free from its natural enemies. And when I'm talking about natural enemies here, we're talking about diseases, we're talking about herbivores, and in particular, insect herbivores. So insect herbivores are probably the most important governors of plant production in any system. Every single plant has got at least one insect that can only feed on it. And what we do as biocontrol scientists is we go back to where the invasive species came from, and we survey for the natural enemies, and we look for insects, and then we bring them back to where the plant is a problem, and we study them for a very long time to make sure that they can only feed on our target plant, and that they have no impact on any plant other than what we want them to feed on. And that is called being host specific, or mono, meaning one, phagous, eating. So we're looking for these host specific monophagous natural enemies that can then exert that top-down pressure that we want. And that is what we call biological control. Water hyacinth, we've released a whole lot of control agents way back from the 1970s. We've got some weevils, there's a little mite, a pathogen, a moth, 2 bugs, and a grasshopper. And up until 2010, we had this whole suite of control agents released on water hyacinth in South Africa. They're also released in other parts of the world. And all of these can only feed on water hyacinth. And this is the type of damage that they do to the plants. We've got leaf feeders, we've got stem borers, we've got sap suckers. So they damage the plant from all different angles. And even though we've got that amount of damage, this is what we still dealt with. And why? Because eutrophication, or that influx of nitrates and phosphates, limits the success of classical biological control. So we've got those abundant resources coming in because of our poor water quality that then prevents the amount of herbivory that the control agents can do. In addition, these insects are coming from low altitude, warm places. So the Amazon is in the tropics, it's very hot and humid, and that's where these insects have evolved. And what do? We bring them across to South Africa. We throw them into the high veld. I mean, I'm sure all of you are wearing scarves and hats and gloves at the moment. And we say, there you go, please reproduce and make lots of babies and be very happy. And so not only is it this eutrophication that's limiting the efficacy of biocontrol, it's also a climate mismatch. This is Delta Park in Johannesburg. This is what the park looks like in springtime. In autumn, the plants start to go quite brown, and in winter, the plants are fairly frosted and dead. So imagine being a little insect in this system. First of all, your food source is dead, and second of all, you're freezing cold. And so development of these insects is severely hampered by temperature. Summer comes back. Where are the insects? They're not there, and the plants just regrow. So in 2013, even though we knew all of this, we had been working on a new control agent, a little hopper called Megamelus cutularis, and we released this little hopper into these conditions and hoped that it would do what it's supposed to do. And this is where we released it, the Coetzee River, which is in the Eastern Cape near Stutterheim. This is a picture of me releasing it in November 2013. Out these little guys hopped their first taste of freedom in South Africa after being in quarantine for years. And then we expect them to do well on a system that looks like this in winter. We looked at the thermal physiology of these insects, and if you have a look down here at this green spot, this is where the Coetzee River is. And these numbers are how many generations they can produce. 2.3 in a year, 0 over winter. So they cannot develop over winter. We're quite interested in all these systems up here, which is where we are right now, or where you guys are right now. This is Gauteng. All these dots are water hyacinth infestations. And have a look at these green underlined numbers. That's how many generations this little Megamelus can complete over winter. It's not even one, but we released them anyway. And what we found was that over time, the water hyacinth, which is this black line over here, and this is the biomass, so how much the water hyacinth weighs. So every month we went and we took a whole lot of plants and we weighed them per meter, and we got kilograms per meter squared. And through winter, it sort of trucks along between 5 and 10 kilos, and then reached a maximum in January, which is when we would expect a plant to reach its maximum. At the same time, very little megamelis around. So this gray line is the number of insects per meter squared. So nothing August, nothing September, nothing December. But then we slowly start to get an increase. So they did manage to survive the winter. It just takes them a really long time to increase their population size. So water hyacinth population size increased, was a maximum in January. It then started to decline. Why? Because the biocontrol agents were feeding on it, and that allowed their population to increase. But now, because the water hyacinths decreased, the insects decreased, and also it was becoming winter. So just remember, just in this, what we want to do is try and get as many insects as possible out in October, November, as the plants start to increase, so that we reduce the peak in the summertime. So going from a 4-month gap, hopefully we could reduce that gap between the peaks in the two populations. So let's focus on these high-felt dams. Okay, this is where we're talking about. Joburg is down here. Here's Pretoria, where a lot of you are right now. And I'm specifically going to look at Hartbeespoort Dam. And all of these systems, Roodeplaat, Bonnecourt, are highly eutrophic or hypertrophic, and probably the most hypertrophic dams in Africa. This is Hartbeespoort Dam from the air. And all the green stuff here is water hyacinth. And this is a picture taken in 2017, which is when we were called in to come and do something about the water hyacinth. Now, for those of you who don't know, Harties is the second biggest tourist hotspot in South Africa after the Cape Town waterfront. I sometimes find that hard to believe, but apparently it is. It's been hypertrophic since the 70s. Water hyacinth has been controlled with chemicals, so with herbicides by the Department of Water Affairs, and this was successful in the 80s, but they never addressed the eutrophication. And so the water quality got worse and worse. They had to spray more and more herbicide, and so in 2007, they initiated a program, a remediation program, spent millions and millions of rands on it because they never addressed eutrophication. And by 2017, DWS pulled the plug on this project because they weren't getting results. And what happened? Water hyacinth exploded. And this is what the water looked like. Huge abundant resources, so a lot of green stuff. All the available agents were on the plants since the 1990s. And this is a satellite image of the dam taken on the 6th of March, 2018. I've got a very clever student who can, he developed an app, and we can work out the amount of water hyacinth on a number of our dams from satellite images. This river here is the Crocodile River, and that's coming in from Joburg and Pretoria, and it carries all that effluent rich in nitrates and phosphates. And coming in from the west is the Magalies River. It's not as polluted. And then there's a couple other little rivers that come in carrying in heavy nutrient loads, and it flows out over here down towards Brits and all the way along to the Botswana border, carrying all that bad stuff. So on the 6th of March, I went to Hartbeespoort, and this is what I found. A lot of damage on the plants. The control agents were clearly there, but because we have these abundant resources, we have a huge amount of primary producers, and no matter how many herbivores were on the system, it just wasn't enough. And this is what we call classical biological control, where you release these insects and hope like hell that they are going to do their thing. And what we realized we needed to do is we had to change our approach to frequent inundative mass releases of this new bug at Harties. And we almost used it as our scientific experimental project. What if we continuously release insects over a couple of years, can we get on top of the plant? And so, in Grahamstown at Rhodes University, we've got a mass rearing facility called the Sisonke Bioneck Mass Rearing Facility. And here we employ members from the community who are physically disabled. And they rear and collect the insects for us, and then we package them up into little, you might think it was a curry container or a takeaway container, and through Postnet or couriers, we can send these all over the country. And so we sent thousands, about between 6,000 and 10,000 insects every 2 weeks to Hearties. My student, Kenil Wesebola, would receive them and release them. And then we also set up what we call a rearing station at one of the local schools, where we could also rear these insects. And some of the school kids would help us to collect the insects and release them into the dam. And so this was our frequent inundative mass release program. So that had been going on 2018, 2019, and my word, we still had 35% cover of Hartbeespoort Dam in the beginning of summer in 2019. But in December, we were down to 20%. And we're like, what? That's great. We could see some herbivore damage, but it wasn't that obvious. But then in January, we were called. Well, actually, I had another project going on at the dam, and just before we arrived, we were phoned to say, listen, Hartbeespoort Dam has been sprayed. Somebody has come over illegally in the night and has sprayed the water hyacinth, and it is brown and it is dying. So we went to have a look, and this is at the dam wall, and here you can see all these dead and brown dying plants. This was not herbicide. This was biological control. And I'll show you a picture now, but one of the reasons we knew why is if it had been herbicide, all these plants, these green bits that are not water hyacinth, would have died as well from the herbicide spray. But instead, they were growing on top of the water hyacinth. And when we had a look at the plants, look at these little insects. They had just exploded. And so had the neocotyna weevils. So we had an explosion of insects in the absence of any herbicidal control following these inundative mass releases. By the 27th of January that year, 2020, there was 5% of water hyacinth left on Hartbeespoort Dam, and we just couldn't believe our eyes. 30th of July, right in the very depth of COVID, but thank goodness the satellites still flew over during COVID, we were down to 1.7% of water hyacinth cover. But then October came, it's springtime, look at all this green, what was going on? Seeds. So water hyacinth is so invasive, firstly because it can use all those resources, but also because it produces thousands of seeds, and those seeds can remain viable for more than 25 years. And seeing as water hyacinth had been on Hartbeespoort Dam since the 1960s, you can imagine how huge those seed banks must be in the dam. We did a study where we found approximately 2,500 seeds per meter squared, and at least half of those could generate within 3 days of good conditions. So you imagine this empty dam, lots of light in, all the nutrients in the world, and sunlight penetrating, warming up in springtime, and so these little seedlings started to generate. And where were the insects? Well, obviously they had all died off because they could only feed on water hyacinth, so they died off over the winter, and so we were back to square one. By the 2nd of December, the dam was 42% covered with water hyacinth. So what did we do? We carried on with our inundative release program. We just reared and reared and released and released. We also set up more rearing facilities around the dam, and this is at the Coves, which is one of the very fancy, expensive facilities. And there in the background, you can see these little greenhouse tunnels where we grow the plants and rear the insects, and then the people from the Coves could collect the insects and put them onto the dam. We also sent thousands of megamelis from the CBC, from our mass relief station. And in November, you can see we released about 90,000 insects on one occasion. And just have a look here, we're releasing around between, let's say, October and January each year. Those are our main releases. And then with not much over the winter months. And the bugs exploded. Look at that, there's just thousands of insects on the plants. And that's me looking at these plants, just incredibly elated because of the amount of insects on the plants. By the 13th of February, we were down to 17%. The plants were dead and dying. The insects were escaping from the plants because there was no nutrition left in them. These are the little weevils, and they died because they couldn't feed on anything else. Megamelis swarmed. This is the tennis court at the Coves, and those are bugs and the like. That is just megamelis. And in the morning, the poor staff were left with cleaning up these millions of megamelis that were escaping from these dead and dying plants, looking for more water hyacinths to feed on. It was very sad. We had to have like masses and masses of funerals for all these poor dead agents. And by the 12th of March, look at that, back down to 7%. And this is at the cove. This is what the plants looked like at the end of March. And by May, there was not a plant left on the system. And that was all due to biological control. So if we move from this classical approach of releasing insects and hoping that they do well to an augmentative approach, we can change these cycles of water hyacinth and the hoppers. So the green here is water hyacinth, peaking in November, December of 2020, peaking in November, December, January of 2021, 22, and then the insects peaking much sooner than that first graph that I showed you. We've got a much smaller gap between the two peaks in the populations. And that's because we've increased this top-down pressure. So even though we've got abundant resources, we can still have an impact on this pool of primary producers. But what we need to do is, if you remember, I showed you our megamelis releases focus around October, November. What we need to do is much earlier in the season so that we can really bring these peaks of water hyacinth down. And that's what we're aiming for at the moment, with masses and masses of rearing stations being set up and insects being reared. And we've been covered by the Mail and Guardian, Insect Army winning the fight. The Times of London followed the story. Tiny insect with big appetite makes short work of invasive water hyacinth. And so just to conclude, and I think this has been a bit of a whirlwind tour for you guys, is that although water hyacinth biocontrol is limited by eutrophication, we know this, those nutrients are supplying abundant resources. It's limited by cold winters that kills the insects. It's limited by interference, and in this case, I'm talking about herbicidal control. So there's a lot of systems where they still do spray herbicide, and this kills the plants and the insects. And then obviously these huge seed banks, which come back every season, we can get control of the plants if we implement an inundative mass release program in the absence of herbicide operations. And one of the most important things we realize is that stakeholder involvement is crucial if we want to close that winter gap. And here's another one of these tunnels. And as I said, we've set up 9 around Hardebeestpoort Dam. And with the community involvement, we're hoping that we keep these plants green now over winter with lots of megamelis on. So as soon as those little seedlings start to generate, we can just inundate the plants with insects that we've reared over winter. And all of this is in an attempt to control the world's worst weed and to take this technology to the rest of the world where water hyacinth is a problem, and particularly in Africa. And that's where I will end this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julie. Very informative.
Great.
Yeah, yes, no, it is very informative.
It's B-train.
No, I think it really teaches one to think, because I mean, it's a pretty plant, if I can say it like that.
It's beautiful. That's why it was sent around the world.
Yeah, so if you see this pretty plant, you don't think it's invasive, or if you see some insects dying, you wouldn't always think it's a good thing, but they were actually there for a good reason. Okay.
Sorry. So we
Go
have
for
a
it,
question.
Michelle.
Thank you. So the students would like to know, if you're removing these plants, aren't you ending up with algal blooms or something else suddenly taking over, or using that available resources in space?
It's an excellent question, and yes, exactly. So while I like to pat myself on the back and say, look how we're dealing with this plant problem, we're not dealing with the actual source of the problem, which is the pollution, which is the water quality. And it's a wicked problem in that we know what the problem is. Everybody says, but you just, you're not dealing with the actual issue at hand. but we don't have the money. Our municipalities don't have the money to maintain their wastewater treatment works. We don't, the Department of Water and Sanitation is completely overwhelmed with the amount of degradation of our water treatment works. And I think it's going to take a really, really long time to mitigate, to clean up our water. And I think it needs to start with each and every one of us to be aware of what we're putting down our toilets, down our sinks. You know, what shampoo are you using? What laundry soap are you using? You know, we have to look at informal settlements where we've got non-point sewage just flowing straight into rivers. Can we not build small wetlands that take up these nutrients before they get into the river? So yes, all that's going to happen, we remove water hyacinth and something else is going to use the nutrients in that system. And in this case, as Aisha said right at the beginning, there is a new plant on Hartebeespoort Dam called Salvinia minima. And we know water hyacinth is going to go now and Salvinia is going to come back over the winter. But a good thing is we have a little control agent for it that I'm waiting for permission from Environmental Affairs to release. But I'm still not dealing with the problem.
Right. And we have a follow-up question in terms of the same kind of thing. Is water hyacinth or other plants actually used in the context to try and reduce that hypertrophic situation in dams, etc.? And isn't it sort of a net positive effect? Yeah, so a controversial question there.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a question we get asked quite frequently. And that term of plants taking up nutrients is called phytoremediation. So remediating the water through plants. Unfortunately, Hartebeespoort Dam is so polluted that if the dam was almost 100% covered and we allowed water hyacinth to grow in it, it could take up, now listen to this, 0.1% of the phosphates coming into the system. So the amount of pollution that is entering that system is so great that no matter how many plants we have on it, they're only going to take out 0.1% of the phosphorus. So it is such a polluted system that the plants on that system aren't going to have any significant effect at all. If it was a small pond on a on a little farm and you wanted to clean it up, sure. You know, if it had a little bit of cow poo in it or a little bit of fertilizer, fine. But on a system such as Hartebeespoort, which receives more pollution than any other system in South Africa, no, having those plants there is not cleaning up the water.
And so is there anything else that can be done to reduce the pollution?
In the dam, you know, I always say, blow up the dam wall. Let all that water run out. Let's start from scratch with clean, functioning wastewater treatment works. Unfortunately, all that disgusting water and all the plants will flow down the Crocodile into Botswana, Zimbabwe, and then out into Mozambique. So probably not a good idea. There are a lot of, there's a lot of people with all kinds of remediation options, things like hydrogen peroxide tablets that oxygenate the water, things like bacterial tablets where the bacteria eat up the phosphates, chemicals. There's a thing called Phoslock, which binds the phosphates to another chemical. But that stuff is still staying in the water. It's not going anywhere. And I think that's what we have to get our heads around. And more is coming in every single day.
Yeah. So would you eat a fish that was caught in Hartebeespoort Dam?
No, absolutely not. I will not let my children swim in Hartebeespoort Dam. I got dysentery the other day when I was working there. Absolutely not. And as for rowing on Roodeplaat Dam, same thing. You know, there's so much E. coli in the water, and no, unfortunately, I would not. You may have seen a whole lot of fish kills in the media the other day. These huge carp, like 30-kilogram carp just dying, and that's due to pollution in the water that took all the oxygen out the water, and these poor fish just died.
Thank you. So is there somewhere in South Africa where we can swim in the rivers? I mean, this hyacinth is
Yeah.
everywhere. Okay.
No,
Just not
you
the
want to
second.
swim high. You want to swim high up away from human settlements. Rivers
Okay.
do, no, I'm being facetious, but rivers do have an ability to, I'm going to say heal themselves, because that sounds very airy-fairy, but they can remediate themselves, you know, over a length, but it's the impoundments, the dams. So we are a very water poor country, and so we have to dam up all our rivers, but in doing so, we're also allowing them to become these toilet bowls, essentially.
Yeah, so I think that links actually to the question that I want to ask, because this is part like of a domino effect. So I wanted to know, I think you touched on it, the insect megamilus. It doesn't eat other plants. So it was brought in, is that a form of co-evolution, or is it because it was brought in from a different country?
Exactly, it's co-evolution. So we're looking for natural enemies that have co-evolved with their host plant, and they've co-evolved to rely solely on that plant for their nutrition and development. And so they, you know, you think surely all those insects, they're going to eat something, but they physiologically cannot. You know, when they were swarming, those huge swarms, we had lots of very unhappy people around Hartbeespoort Dam phoning and saying these insects are biting us. They, you know, they're in our food. We can't sit outside at night, which is, I mean, it is a huge nuisance. But as for the biting, they just can't. They don't have the mouth parts to bite. Unfortunately, there's lots of other little chochos that also swarm, mosquitoes, biting flies, and I think they just all got thrown in with this general swarm of insects. And so we really had to do a lot of public relations and say, just bear this, just have the insects in your wine at night, and or lock your, you know, close your windows, because in a few weeks there will be no more water hyacinths left on the dam, and then you can take your motorboat out again.
Yeah.
But people are, you know, everybody wants everything.
Yeah, instantly. But so I don't know much about biological control. So this in other parts of the world, were you just lucky to have the megamilus that co-evolved, or is it common like for biological control?
No, that's a very good question. So you can only collect the control agent where the plant, from the plant center of origin. So in this case, the Amazon. And over the years, we've got very good collaborations with other countries that practice biological control, and in particular, the USA. And then we work a lot with colleagues in Argentina and Brazil. And you essentially go on a boat up the Amazon, you find the plants, and you have a look at what's feeding on them. And being an entomologist, you know, okay, a grasshopper is not going to be a great control agent because they usually eat lots of different things, but bugs, weevils, those kind of things are usually quite specific, or they might eat one or two or maybe three things in the same genus. So a lot of these control agents can feed on, well, not a lot. There's like one or two that can feed on other plants in the same genus as water hyacinth. One of the bugs that I showed you can feed on a plant called Poncideria cordata, which is in South Africa, but it's also invasive. So when we do the testing to make sure for the safety testing, we then say, well, yes, we know it can feed on Poncideria cordata, but that's not a problem for us. It cannot feed on any indigenous species in South Africa. It doesn't feed on any plant of economic importance. And so we're happy to request permission to release. And we then, at the same time, scientists in America will be doing this, and scientists in Australia will be doing this. And then we sort of come together, we share results. I might write to our departments of environmental affairs and say, well, the USA has released megamilus. They found it safe And since it's released, it has established, so it's a good it might be a good insect for us to consider here.
Okay, so then I'm curious. This is now South Africa, but you said in the beginning, or sort of the beginning, that the plant was given to people all over the world. So there's a specific reason why you release it. I think you said October, and I didn't write that down. January. Yeah. So in other parts of the world, yeah.
No, then it's the other way around. So Northern Hemisphere, obviously, they'll release in their summertime, or their springtime, which would be May, June. And we release ours over our summertime, October, November. But we want to be able to release in springtime in order to catch water hyacinth as it's coming back, so that we don't get those huge mats covering our systems.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. So how long do you think the ecosystem takes to restabilize, or is that relative?
We don't have pristine systems anymore. We have heavily impacted systems. So we have to have restoration goals. We have to decide, well, what are we happy to deal with? Are we happy with some algae in the water, but we can still use a motorboat? Or do we want clean, clear water? And then we need to invest trillions into upgrading our sewage works. So it always depends on what the end use of that system is, as to what your restoration goal is going to be. And then that's usually also determined by how much money it's going to cost.
Oh, okay. That's usually the issue.
Yeah.
Okay, I can go on talking, but we need to go to the primary audience again in case they have any questions. So Michelle, I'm just going to unmute you again. Else I'm not going to stop.
We have no more questions, but some of the students noted that Julie couldn't hear the applause, so we'd like to give another round of applause.
I hear you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much.
Just check the chat.
Yeah, Steve Collins, I will email you.
And then Christina Trump wrote, thank you for the welcome and presentation. I joined from Windhoek, Namibia, where Dr. I think it's Ian
Patterson.
Yes.
Ian Patterson.
From Rhodes University assisted us with biological control for cacti.
Yes, so we don't just work on water weeds at the CEDC. We have an excellent program on invasive cacti. As Christina said, Ian has helped Namibia establish a biocontrol program for some of their cacti, and across South Africa we've got biocontrol programs for these cacti that people love buying their little succulents, right? How many of you go off to a cute little to a nursery and you find a cute little succulent, and then that becomes invasive? So we really have to make sure our nurseries comply, which they largely do, but it's often the sort of the backyard dealers who don't know that end up spreading these things. And so we've got a huge number of invasive cacti in South Africa.
So how is awareness created? Is there a website that we can view?
For what?
To know all the invasive, like cacti or water, like
yes. So there's
a website.
Yeah. The Invasive Species South Africa. I'm just trying to think of invasives.org. Has got the NEMBA list, and NEMBA is our law governing Biodiversity Act. That's the National Environmental Management of Biodiversity Act. And there is the list of invasive species, from terrestrial plants through to fish, through to mammals. So everything that's not allowed is on that list.
Okay, I'm going to have a look at it. I think we lost our primary audience.
It looks like it.
Okay, well, I'm going to have a look. I think this number is very important, because I only learned that postgrad, so I think it's important to share that information. So I think Marit will share that information with them. Okay, they have to leave. Okay, thank you so much.
Julie, I don't have a
No,
question. I just wanted to say thank you so much. It was absolutely super working with you. And yeah, I'm just amazed at your long-term commitment to these issues. And I just, yeah, I really
Thanks.
appreciate it. You saving our dams and rivers. Thank you.